Welcome to our special community spotlight. My name is Keya Mysorekar, and I'm the co-founder of the ASD Project, a platform dedicated to making modern, free autism resources accessible to families, educators, and the community. Our focus is always on practical, real-world tools that foster independence. Today, I'm incredibly excited to welcome our guest, Ruhee Patkar. Ruhee is a registered behavioral technician, or RBT, who works hands-on in the field of implementing positive behavioral supports and helping individuals build vital skills. Ruhee, thank you so much for joining us. We have a lot of great practical topics to cover today surrounding daily living skills, communication, and positive behavioral support. Let's dive straight into our first question. To start us off, could you explain our listeners what a registered behavior technician actually does? What inspired you to enter this field, and what is your favorite part of working hands-on with autistic individuals?
Yeah, good question. So, an RBT is a paraprofessional who works in the behavioral health field. So, I work one on one with clients and implement treatment plans that are made by BCBA, which is a board certified behavior analyst. And these are professionals who have master's degrees in behavioral analysis or behavioral therapy. And they observe the client and their behaviors and create interventions and plans, and then the RBT incorporates those plans into the session. So, other than implementing treatment plans, some core responsibilities of my job are managing behaviors, collecting data, and also being a primary stakeholder in the client's treatment plan. And what I mean by this is that in order for ABA therapy to be successful, it does take a village. So that includes the client, the RBT, the parents, any other therapists that the client might have, like occupational therapists, speech therapists. And it's important that the RBT communicate what happens in the sessions to the entire team so that we can make sure that treatment is consistent across everything and that we're generalizing the behaviors that we learn in therapy to the client's entire life. So that is, I think, one of my favorite parts about my job and working with autistic individuals. So I primarily work with children. I have worked with children as young as 2 up to adults who are 22 years old. So I do say I have a pretty broad range of ages that I work with. I really enjoy working with young children because it's just so rewarding to see them learn how to communicate and learn independent skills. It's really special when you see that a child is able to advocate for themselves for the first time after you've been working on it for a while. And it's just really rewarding knowing that you're making a real difference in their lives and it's something that's going to help them for the rest of their lives.
That's so great, and it's clear how much passion you have for this work. What I appreciate most about the RBT role is how collaborative and personalized it is to be for every single individual. A major part of an RBT's work is helping clients build communication skills. How do you approach helping a nonverbal or minimally verbal individual find their voice, whether through speech, signs, or communication devices?
Yeah, great question. So, before I entered this field, I primarily thought of communication as written and verbal language, and working with the population that I do has really opened my eyes to how many different types of communication there are. And there are types of communication that everyone uses in their everyday lives, whether or not they think about it. So, in addition to spoken language, there's body language, facial expressions, things like that. So communication skills do look different for each client, and you do have to alter your treatment to support their needs. So, a lot of children who have autism are nonverbal, and my goal is never to get them to speak if they don't want to speak. They don't have to, but they do need to learn how to communicate. And the best way to find out what their preferred method of communication is and what works best for them is pairing. And pairing in ABA is just making sure that you are a positive reinforcer for the client and that they are creating a positive relationship with therapy, because the more the client learns to trust you, the more open they are going to be with you, and the more you're going to get to know them. And that will help you know what methods of communication they prefer. So, and I'll talk about that more later on, but pairing is very important because you do need the client to trust you and to like you. Because if they don't, they're not going to learn from you. You're not going to be able to teach them how to functionally communicate, and those strategies won't take hold. So, I will say a very important thing for me is learning how to read your client. Um, a lot of clients who don't speak do that because they don't want to talk, and that's okay. So in that case, I would suggest an AAC device, which is an alternative and augmentative communication device, which is essentially an iPad with a bunch of symbols on it. And when you touch the symbol, the iPad says the word out loud. So that is a really good way for nonverbal clients to communicate because it's a form of language that they're already used to. They already know all these words. They already know that using these words will gain access to whatever it is that they want. Like they know that if they press water on their AAC device, someone will give them water. That's something they already know. Um, Something that also works with some clients is simple sign language. So when they don't have a device on them or when they're not being receptive to using an AAC, simple sign language is also helpful. So that's things like signing for help, more, open, things like that. Very simple everyday words and terms that they use. That can be a little harder to incorporate because it's an entirely different form of language that they're not used to. And not everyone knows how to read sign language. Not everyone knows what signs mean. So it may not be as easy to generalize it across contexts and environments. So just because I know what it means when you sign for more doesn't mean that your teacher at school will know. It doesn't mean that your friends will know. So an AAC is usually the first method that we try, but if that's not taking, there are so many other ways that you can try to help them communicate. So it really is just important to learn about the client, learn to read what they're trying to tell you, and then just trial and error and see what works for them.
That is incredibly powerful, and providing those alternative communication tools, whether it's AAC devices or sign language, really unlocks so much independence and reduces so much daily frustration. In ABA therapy, it's often talked about how the function of behavior or the reason someone is doing something. How do you figure out what an individual is trying to communicate when they are having a difficult or overwhelming behavioral moment?
Yeah, good question. So, an RBT's role doesn't actually involve determining the function of a behavior. That is a BCBA level task. However, I am in a grad program to become a BCBA. I'm working towards my master's in applied behavior analysis. So, I am learning how to implement those concepts in my everyday work. So, the four general functions of behavior are escape, attention, sensory, and access. And of course, there are more, but those are just the four general buckets that you usually put behaviors into. So, one thing I see a lot is that when you place a demand on a client, like you say, do this puzzle, like do this math problem, whatever, they'll elope. They'll just run out of the room. And that is because they're trying to communicate to you that they need a break. They don't want to do that. However, that is not functional communication. If you're at work, if you're in school, whatever, you can't just run out of the room because you don't like what's happening. So, what we do is we only replace behaviors that are either unsafe or dangerous or non functional. So, like the elopement example that I just used, a functional replacement behavior would be asking for a break. And that could mean saying the word break or using their AAC device or tapping a picture that says break. And that is a functional behavior because that gets you to the same endpoint of getting a break, but you get there in a functional way. So that is sort of how we try to approach behaviors. And another thing I also see very, very often is sensory needs. So oftentimes, children who have autism have higher sensory needs than neurotypical people. And that could be oral sensory, physical sensory, things like that. So I'll use an example from a session that I did recently. So one of my clients has a very high oral sensory need, and she will put things in her mouth that are unsafe, like Play-Doh or metal things she finds on the grounds, things like that. And that's not an okay behavior. That's something that we want to replace. However, the function of the behavior is sensory, and we don't want to take that sensory input away. We want her to still have that sensory input that she is clearly needing. So, an alternative or replacement behavior would be to get a different sensory tool, such as an electric toothbrush or a chewy necklace or something like that, that she can redirect her sensory needs to in a functional manner. So there are a ton of examples, and of course every client is different, but essentially you only want to target socially significant behaviors and make sure that they're getting to what they need in a functional and safe way.
Exactly. Looking at behavior as a form of communication completely changes how we respond to it. It shifts the focus from managing behavior to understanding a need. Many people don't realize that a lot of RBT work looks like play. How do you build a strong, trusting connection with your client so that a therapy feels like a fun, safe place?
Yeah, so this sort of goes back to what I was saying before with the concept of pairing, which is so, so important to me. And it's really the foundation of the successful therapy. And pairing is so important, especially with a new client and a new therapist. So for example, like let's say you're a 7-year-old boy who's just, you just have a new therapist. You're not going to listen to this person who just came into your house or came to your clinic and is telling you what to do. You're not going to listen to them. And because of that, behavior change won't happen. So it's very important that you build a relationship before you place demands. So when I have a new client, what I do is I will spend the first 3 to 5 sessions just playing with them, doing no therapy, no interventions, no demands, just being there with them, getting them used to my presence, making sure they like me and that I'm a positive thing for them because they're not going to learn from me otherwise. And adults are that way too. Like if someone you've never met came up to you and started telling you what to do, you're not going to listen to them. So you need time to get used to the client and the therapist, and build a relationship with them because that's where real change comes. So it's very important for me to pair, and that also does mean knowing what it means to pair with a client. So it doesn't always mean to play with them 24/7 and to always be there with them. So I've had clients who need you to be there with them, right next to them, playing with them, doing a game with them all the time, because that's how they build a positive relationship with you. But I've also had clients where they don't really want you to play with them. They don't really need you to be there doing something with them the whole time. You just need to be in the same room as them so that they know that you're there for them if they need anything. And both of those methods, whatever it is, it still gets you to the same place of creating a positive relationship with the client. Because even if you think that playing with the client is the best way to build a relationship, if they don't like that, they're not going to have a positive relationship with you. And you want them to be excited when the therapist comes. You want them to look forward to therapy. Um, and you yourself need to be a positive reinforcer. So, we talk a lot in ABA therapy about positive reinforcement, and you want to be a positive reinforcer yourself as a therapist for a client. So yeah, you basically just need to read what the client wants and adjust your approach to that because you want therapy to be a positive experience for them and you want it to be fun. And there are a lot of signs that you've paired with someone well. The client will engage with you, they will approach you, you will see less maladaptive behaviors, and signs like that let you know that you've paired well with the client. And then when you place demands on them, they're more likely to listen to you and they're more likely to learn and change their behavior.
That's incredible, and pairing and building that trust is everything. If the individual doesn't feel safe and valued, no meaningful skill building can actually happen. Since our podcast focuses heavily on independence, how do RBTs help clients break down big, overwhelming daily tasks like brushing teeth, getting dressed, or preparing a snack into smaller, manageable steps?
Yeah, so there are a couple of interventions that I use. One of them is called shaping or shaping a skill, and that involves building up a skill starting from a very small step. So, to use an example from a session I did, we were shaping the skill of sitting down at a desk for 10 minutes because she's going to need this skill for school and work. And her baseline, we were able to count that she can sit for 5 seconds, and our goal is 10 minutes. So, we don't want to immediately say, okay, let's sit for 10 minutes. She's not going to be able to do that. And even if she is able to do that, there's no guarantee that it's going to continue. So, what we do is, okay, let's sit for 5 seconds. And then she sits for 5 seconds. You give her a break, you give her a reward, and then you have her sit for 5 seconds again. And then eventually you increase it to 10 seconds, and then a minute, and then 10 minutes. And by that time, she's able to sit for 10 minutes because you've built up to it. You didn't just jump straight into it, which is also what we do in our everyday lives. And that's how you make sure that the behavior is maintained and not just a one-time thing. Um, the other big intervention we use is called task analysis, which is breaking down steps into smaller steps. So, for example, hand washing. We would say first you turn on the water, then wet your hands, then get soap, and you break it down into steps like that so it's easier to digest. And you keep prompting the client, you keep reminding them of what the next step is until they don't need you anymore, because eventually they can do it by themselves. You have broken it down into small enough steps that in their brain, it's not one big unmanageable task, it's a bunch of little steps that they've learned how to do. And it does help it to break it down step by step because there are so many steps to a lot of simple things in our everyday life that we don't even think about because they're so second nature. Like even like brushing your teeth, you have to get the toothbrush, wet the toothbrush, put the toothpaste on, all these different steps. And for us, it seems simple, but the more you break it down, the easier it is to help prompt and go step by step, and then eventually fade the prompts that you're using to help the client get through that task.
100%. Task analysis is such a highly effective strategy, and breaking a complex routine down into a bite sized step can make the goal of independent living feel completely achievable rather than intimidating. As the autism community places a huge emphasis on self advocacy, how do you balance teaching helpful daily skills while still respecting your client's personal boundaries?
That is a really important thing in ABA. So, ABA in general has been moving more and more towards emphasizing client autonomy and dignity, which makes me so happy because I think those are so important, especially when you're working with children, because children don't often have a lot of autonomy. A lot of the times you're being told what to do by adults and things like that. And especially in therapy, it's so important to give them their own autonomy because, as I was mentioning earlier, we want them to have a positive association with therapy. And that's more likely to happen if the client feels like they have a choice and a voice and the ability to have a say in their daily sessions rather than just following directions and doing whatever they're told. And while it is important to provide structure and the client does know that they do have to follow demands, it's important to balance the two. And I will say it's very, very different for each client. It's hard to generalize things like this because every single case is so different. But I always want to make sure that I'm not overwhelming my clients. So RBTs have a certain amount of targets or a certain amount of goals or interventions that they're supposed to do each session. So if your client is having a hard day, something's wrong, they're not feeling well, adjust your session, reduce demands, because the last thing you want is for them to get frustrated. So you always want to keep them happy, relaxed, and engaged. And if you see that they're bored or they're sad, they're agitated, you immediately want to fix that. You need to help them self-regulate. You need to redirect them to something that's going to make them feel better, because all these things will also help them overall feel better, and that will help with behavior change. And it is really important to also know how to think on your feet and adjust your sessions on the fly because everyone has bad days. Our clients are going to have bad days sometimes. Like they're not going to be in the typical way that they normally are in our sessions. And it's important that you're still able to implement interventions and goals that you've been working on in a way that suits their needs that day without overwhelming them, but still working on the same skills.
Yeah, for sure. That balance is crucial. Respecting bodily autonomy and teaching individuals that they have the right to say no is just as important as teaching them daily living skills. An RBT is only with a client for a few hours a day, but parents are there 24/7. What is one simple strategy or mindset shift that you recommend parents use at home to help reinforce the positive progress their child is making?
Yeah, I think it's so important that we acknowledge that ABA therapy is not just the RBT, the parents are heavily, heavily involved. And it is very important that we take the skills that the client is using in therapy and generalizing them. We don't want them to only be able to request things functionally in therapy. That's not the point. We want them to request things with their parents, with their peers, with their teachers. So, one thing that I have been doing recently with one of my cases, we are teaching the client to use an AAC device, and we are doing this by reinforcing her whenever she uses the AAC device. So if she asks for bubbles with her device, we immediately give her bubbles. If she asks me for a toy, I give her a toy. So I'm reinforcing her asking for something with access to the item so that she knows, oh, when I press this on my device, I get this item. So we are training the parents also to continue that even when the therapist isn't there. So we're telling them if she asks for something with her device, reinforce it right away. If she asks for this with her words, reinforce it right away. And it's also important to reinforce small things. Like it doesn't have to be like one big giant behavior change because behavior change doesn't happen overnight. It's slowly built up to. So if you see a small thing that your child is doing that is progress, you want to reinforce that because that means that they're learning to generalize their skills outside of the therapy environment, and that's something that you want to keep going. So it's important for the parents to know what the goals are that their child is working towards, which is why it's so important to have that communication between the ABA therapist and the family so that everyone knows what the goals are, so that those same things can be reinforced in and out of the therapy room.
For sure, consistency across environments is key, and simple environmental modifications or visual schedules at home can make a massive difference for families. For any autistic teenagers or young adults listening who might be working with an RBT or therapist right now and feel frustrated with their progress, what encouraging words do you have for them?
The biggest thing I would say is that behavior change takes time. It takes time and it takes a lot of patience and a lot of hard work for everyone involved. Because it's not easy. You're not gonna overnight see behaviors change. You're not gonna overnight see anything like that happen. So I would just say that to be really patient and to be gentle with yourself for everyone, for RBTs and for clients, young adults, anyone. Because it's hard. You're learning a lot of new skills that you're not used to, and learning new things is difficult for everyone. And these are skills that you're learning to replace things that you already know how to do in a different way, which is just another added layer of difficulty. So it does take a lot of patience and it does take a lot of time, but the most important thing is just to be gentle with yourself and give yourself grace and know that you're working really hard and then it's all going to pay off.
Thank you. That is really good. And before we end today, do you have like any last message as an RBT that you'd like to send out to the public?
I think I pretty much covered everything. But I would just say being an RBT is so, so rewarding. And even though it is difficult at times, it can be frustrating. It's just so worth it to see the impact you're making in people's lives.
Definitely, Ruhi. Those are incredibly encouraging words to end on. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your practical advice, and your perspective as an RBT with us today. The work you do on the ground is so incredibly valuable. To our audience, thank you for tuning into this conversation on daily skills, communication, and positive support. If you want to access free resource guides, visual schedules, and toolkits to help implement some of these strategies at home, visit the asdproject.org and sign up for your free library account today. Keep advocating, keep supporting, and we will see you in our next space. Thank you so much.